Hi, fourth graders. It's Miss Leon. We are moving on to our next lesson in our historical fiction book club unit. We are going to be talking about character perspective. Character perspective are the ways characters act and how they feel, and it is shaped by their roles and also their time period. So when I say their roles, I mean like their roles in society or even in their family. So, if they're a mom or if they're a kid, how they act or they feel based upon that role in their family, or if they're a student or a teacher, and then in the time period that we're talking about, because in different time periods, characters have certain rights or responsibilities or, things that they are and are not allowed to do. So, for instance, we're going to be looking at Anne Marie. Did Anne Marie act differently than you would if you felt there was danger? So, looking back in chapter one, you'll notice we're in this part where Anne Marie and Ellen are running, and then they had the German soldier holler at them to stop.
Hair flew behind her, and Ellen's dark pigtails bounced against her shoulders. Wait for me, wailed little Kirsty, left behind, but the two older girls weren't listening. Anne-Marie outdistanced her friend quickly, even though one of her shoes came untied as she sped along the street called Osterbrogade, past the small shops and cafes of her neighborhood here in northeast Copenhagen. Laughing, she skirted an elderly lady in black who carried a shopping bag made of string. A young woman pushing a baby in a carriage moved aside to make way. The corner was just ahead. Anne-Marie looked up, panting, just as she reached the corner. Her laughter stopped. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. Halt, the soldier ordered in a stern voice. The German word was as familiar as it was frightening. Anne-Marie had heard it often enough before, but it had never been directed at her until now. Behind her, Ellen also slowed and stopped. Far back, little Kirsty was plodding along, her face in a pout because the girls hadn't waited for her. Anne-Marie stared up. There were two of them. That meant two helmets, two sets of cold eyes glaring at her, and four tall, shiny boots planted firmly on the sidewalk, blocking her path to home. And it meant two rifles, gripped in the hands of the soldiers. She stared at the rifles first. Then finally, she looked into the face of the soldier who had ordered her to halt. Why are you running? The harsh voice asked. His Danish was very poor. 3 years, Anne-Marie thought with contempt. 3 years they've been in our country, and still they can't speak our language. I was racing with my friend, she answered politely. We have races at school every Friday, and I want to do well, so I... Her voice trailed away, the sentence unfinished. Don't talk so much, she told herself. Just answer them, that's all. She glanced back. Ellen was motionless on the sidewalk a few yards behind her. Farther back, Kirsty was still sulking and walking slowly toward the corner. Nearby, a woman had come to the doorway of a shop and was standing silently, watching. One of the soldiers, the taller one, moved toward her. Anne-Marie recognized him as the one she and Ellen always called in whispers, the giraffe, because of his height and the long neck that extended from his stiff collar. He and his partner were always on this corner. He prodded the corner of her backpack with the stock of his rifle. Anne-Marie trembled. What is in here? He asked loudly. From the corner of her eye, she saw the shopkeeper move quietly back into the shadows of the doorway, out of sight. School books, she answered truthfully. Are you a good student? The soldier asked. He seemed to be sneering. Yes. What is your name? Anne-Marie Johansson. Your friend, is she a good student too? He was looking beyond her at Ellen, who hadn't moved. Anne-Marie looked back too and saw that Ellen's face, usually rosy-cheeked, was pale, and her dark eyes were wide. She nodded at the soldier. Better than me, she said. What is her name? Ellen. And who is this? He asked, looking to Anne-Marie's side. Kirsty had appeared there suddenly, scowling at everyone. My little sister. She reached down for Kirsty.
After hearing this recording, I find it a little bit interesting, or it seemed odd, that Anne Marie said that she found the word stop or halt to be frightening. Typically when I say stop or something, does that make a student frightened? I don't think that I'm always frightening my son when I say stop, but sometimes, maybe embarrassed, but not frightened. So, what about you? Do you think that it makes sense that Anne Marie is frightened by those soldiers saying stop? So I want you guys to think about Anne Marie's act reaction to this, remembering today's lesson, where this is one of those times or those places where it helps to ask why. Why was it that Anne Marie was frightened when the soldiers told her to stop? I want you to think about the times in which Anne Marie lived in, which is World War II, right? And they were over there in Denmark where they were starting to round up the Jewish population and take them. So those guards are not exactly friendly. They're kind of an enemy where you see there in their reading that she had thought to herself, they've been here for so long and they don't even know how to speak our language very well. It talked about them carrying guns. It had referenced their eyes as two sets of cold eyes, and they are Nazi soldiers. So that's probably why when they're saying halt or stop to her, that it's a little bit scary or a little bit frightening to a little girl, and a little girl in which these soldiers are kind of taking over in the town that she lives in. So we're going to read aloud another part of the same chapter, and we're going to think about our character, and how their perspective or how the way that they see things is shaped by their roles, like who are they in the world, and what is going on in that time period or in that place that they are living in or happening to be in during that reading.
Mama always burned it after she and Papa had read it. But Anne Marie heard Mama and Papa talk, sometimes at night, about the news they received that way. News of sabotage against the Nazis, bombs hidden and exploded in the factories that produced war materials, and industrial railroad lines damaged so that the goods couldn't be transported. And she knew what resistance meant. Papa had explained when she overheard the word and asked. The resistance fighters were Danish people, no one knew who because they were very secret, who were determined to bring harm to the Nazis however they could. They damaged the German trucks and cars and bombed their factories. They were very brave. Sometimes they were caught and killed. I must go and speak to Ellen, Mrs. Rosen said, moving toward the door. You girls walk a different way to school tomorrow. Promise me, Anne Marie, and Ellen will promise too.
Okay, so as we're going to continue listening to this, I want you guys to pay close attention to the different ways um, of how each character is responding. We have Anne Marie, Kirsty, and Mrs. Rosen. And remember that Mrs. Rosen is Ellen's mom, and Ellen is Anne Marie's best friend.
We will, Mrs. Rosen, but what does it matter? There are German soldiers on every corner. They will remember your faces, Mrs. Rosen said, turning in the doorway to the hall. It is important to be one of the crowd, always. Be one of many. Be sure that they never have a reason to remember your face. She disappeared into the hall and closed the door behind her. He'll remember my face, Mama, Kirsty announced happily, because he said I look like his little girl. He said I was pretty. If he has such a pretty little girl, why doesn't he go back to her like a good father? Mrs. Johansson murmured, stroking Kirsty's cheek. Why doesn't he go back to his own country? Mama, is there anything to eat? Anne Marie asked, hoping to take her mother's mind away from the soldiers. Take some bread and give a piece to your sister. With butter? Kirsty asked hopefully. No butter, her mother replied. You know that. Kirsty sighed as Anne Marie went to the bread box in the kitchen. I wish I could have a cupcake, she said, a big yellow cupcake with pink frosting. Her mother laughed. For a little girl, you have a long memory, she told Kirsty. There hasn't been any butter or sugar for cupcakes for a long time, a year at least. When will there be cupcakes again? When the war ends, Mrs. Johansson said. She glanced through the window down to the street corner where the soldiers stood, their faces.
All right. So after hearing that, I want you to remember that in this scene, Mrs. Johansson just told Ellen's mother that the German soldiers must be on edge by the recent activities by the Danish resistance fighters. And remember, the Danish resistance fighters are the Danish people who are resisting or fighting against the Nazi soldiers or the Nazis. Intention or what they are called to do in that country. So we're noticing that all of these characters are alive at the same time in the same town, but they're all reacting differently. You see that Miss Rosen and also Mrs. Rosen and Mrs. Johansson are more worried. They're wanting these girls to take a different way home than they always have been before. Kirsty just doesn't seem to be affected at all. She just thinks that, that these guys have been around forever, so she isn't worried about them talking to her or stopping them. So why do we think that Mrs. Rosen reacted differently than Kirsty? How did that how did their position in life make those reactions differently? What influences each of those characters? Their age, maybe their religions, maybe their roles. One is a mom, one is a child, it's very young. Maybe their knowledge of the world's events during that time. So I want you to think about the way that the personal timeline of these events intersect with the historical, the actual events and timeline of what is happening in that place and that time. So we are going to go ahead and dig in to our own reading groups and think about how the timelines of our characters fit in with the timelines of what is happening in the world.